The Iranian plateau occupies a vast stretch of territory between Mesopotamia to the west and the mountains of Central Asia to the east, bordered by the Caspian Sea in the north and the Persian Gulf in the south. This geography made the plateau a natural corridor for migration, trade, and military movement throughout ancient history, rather than an isolated or peripheral zone. The landscape itself, a mixture of high mountain ranges, arid interior basins, and fertile valleys, shaped the way human communities organized themselves, favoring dispersed tribal groups and regional strongholds over single unified states in the earliest periods of settlement. Long before any Persian Empire existed, this land was home to a patchwork of peoples, and understanding how it eventually became the seat of one of history's great empires requires tracing developments that predate the Persians themselves by many centuries. Around the beginning of the second millennium BCE, groups speaking Indo-Iranian languages began moving southward from the Eurasian steppe into the region that would later be called Iran. This movement was not a single dramatic invasion, but a prolonged and uneven process of migration, settlement, and cultural blending with existing populations already living on the plateau, including groups connected to the older Elamite civilization in the southwest. Over the following centuries, distinct Iranian-speaking peoples emerged within this broader migratory wave, most significantly the Medes in the northwest, and the Persians further south in the region historically known as Persis or Pars. These two groups shared linguistic and cultural roots, but developed as politically separate populations, each establishing its own patterns of leadership, alliance, and territorial control long before either produced anything resembling a centralized state. The evidence for these early centuries comes primarily from external sources, particularly Assyrian royal records, since neither the Medes nor the early Persians left extensive written accounts of their own history at this stage. Assyrian inscriptions from the 9th and 8th centuries BCE mention Median chiefs and settlements as targets of periodic military campaigns and tribute demands, describing a landscape of scattered fortified towns and local rulers, rather than a unified kingdom. These campaigns tell us that Median communities were established firmly enough in the Zagros Mountains and surrounding highlands to be considered significant enough to warrant repeated Assyrian attention, even though political organization among them remained fragmented for generations. It was only gradually, through processes that remain only partially visible in the surviving record, that Median groups began consolidating under more centralized leadership, capable of coordinating larger territories and mounting sustained resistance to outside powers. Later Greek historical tradition, particularly the account of Herodotus writing centuries afterward, credits a figure named Deities with unifying the Median tribes and founding the city of Ecbatana as a royal capital sometime in the 7th century BCE. Herodotus describes Deioces establishing formal court ceremony, a system of justice, and defensive walls around his new capital, transforming what had been loosely connected clans into a more coherent kingdom. Modern historians treat this account with appropriate caution, since Herodotus wrote generations after the events he describes and likely incorporated elements of later Median or Persian political tradition into his narrative of Median origins. Nonetheless, the broader pattern the account reflects, a gradual shift from fragmented tribal leadership towards centralized kingship, is consistent with archaeological evidence from sites in the region and with the general historical trajectory that allowed the Medes to become a significant regional power within a few generations. The clearest and best documented Median ruler in this early period is Cyrus, who came to the throne around 625 BCE, according to most chronological reconstructions. Cyaxares reorganized Median military forces, reportedly separating infantry, cavalry, and other units into more specialized formations rather than relying on undifferentiated tribal levies, an innovation that significantly improved Median battlefield effectiveness. He also pursued a deliberate policy of alliance building, most notably forging a marriage connection between the Median and Babylonian royal houses that secured joint military cooperation against their common Assyrian rival. This alliance proved decisive. Assyria, which had dominated Mesopotamia and exerted influence over surrounding regions for centuries, had entered a period of internal weakness and external pressure by the late 7th century BCE. In 612 BCE, combined Median and Babylonian forces attacked and destroyed Nineveh, the great Assyrian capital, effectively ending Assyrian imperial power in a single devastating campaign. The destruction of Assyria fundamentally reshaped the political map of the ancient Near East. Babylonia inherited direct control over Mesopotamia and the Levant, while the Medes expanded their own authority across the Iranian plateau and into eastern Anatolia, pushing their frontier as far as the Halys River, where a negotiated boundary with the Lydian kingdom eventually stabilized the region. For the first time, an Iranian-led power stood among the dominant states of the ancient world, commanding a wide sweep of territory and considerable military reputation. Cyaxares died around 585 BCE, leaving this expanded and strengthened kingdom to his son Astyages, who inherited a state that appeared, at least outwardly, to be one of the more stable and powerful players in the region. It was within the shadow of this Median kingdom that the Persians developed as a subordinate but increasingly significant regional power. Early Persian rulers are associated with a smaller kingdom centered on Anshan, a territory whose name and location connected to earlier Elamite political geography in what is now southwestern Iran. Persian kings, during this period, including a line of rulers using the title of King of Anshan, functioned largely as vassals within the Median political order, providing tribute and military support while retaining internal autonomy over their own affairs. This arrangement mirrors patterns seen elsewhere in the ancient Near East, where regional dynasties frequently operated as subordinate partners within larger imperial systems rather than as fully independent actors, a status that could shift dramatically when opportunity or ambition allowed. That opportunity arrived through Cyrus II, a Persian ruler whose family later Achaemenid tradition would present as descending from a founding ancestor named Achaemenes, giving the eventual empire its historical name. Cyrus inherited the throne of Anshan around the middle of the 6th century BCE, at a time when Median authority under Astyages, though outwardly still dominant, faced growing internal strain, including apparent friction between the king and elements of his own nobility. The precise sequence of events that led to open conflict between Cyrus and Astyages remains debated among historians, since surviving accounts, including later Babylonian chronicles and Greek narratives written well after the fact, do not agree fully on details or motivations. What can be established with reasonable confidence is that around 550 BCE, Cyrus led a Persian revolt against Median overlordship, and that this revolt succeeded in decisively defeating and capturing Astyages, effectively transferring supreme authority over the Iranian plateau from the Medes to the Persians. This transition deserves careful framing, because it was not simply a story of one ethnic group triumphing over another through military superiority alone. Ancient sources suggest that internal Median discontent, possibly involving defections among the nobility to Cyrus's cause, played a significant role in the speed and completeness of the Median collapse. Equally important, Cyrus did not attempt to destroy Median institutions, elite, or military structures once victory was achieved. Instead, Median administrative personnel, aristocratic families, and army units were substantially absorbed into what became a joint Medo-Persian ruling structure, with Ecbatana continuing to function as an important administrative center even as ultimate political authority shifted southward toward Persian territory. This pattern of absorption rather than destruction would become a recurring feature of Achaemenid expansion in the years that followed, distinguishing Cyrus's approach from more purely destructive patterns of conquest practiced by earlier Near Eastern empires such as Assyria. With Median territory secured, Cyrus turned his attention to the major powers bordering his newly enlarged kingdom. To the west lay Lydia, a wealthy kingdom controlling much of Asia Minor and the Aegean coastline under its famously rich king Croesus. Cyrus defeated Croesus in a series of campaigns culminating in the capture of the Lydian capital at Sardis, bringing the Greek cities of the Anatolian coast, along with Lydia's considerable material wealth, under Persian control. This victory extended Achaemenid authority to the shores of the Aegean Sea and established a Persian presence that would eventually bring the empire into direct contact and later conflict with the mainland Greek world. Cyrus's most significant conquest, however, came in 539 BCE with the fall of Babylon, still one of the most important cities and political centers in the entire Near East. The internal political situation in Babylon at the time of Cyrus's approach appears to have been unstable, with the reigning king Nabonidus reportedly unpopular among segments of the Babylonian priesthood and population due to religious policies that favored the moon god Sin over the traditionally dominant Babylonian deity Marduk. Whether through negotiated surrender, internal defection, or a combination of both, Babylon fell to Persian forces with comparatively little destructive resistance, and Cyrus entered the city presenting himself not as a foreign conqueror imposing new gods and customs, but as a legitimate ruler restoring proper order and religious practice that Nabonidus had allegedly neglected. This self-presentation survives in a remarkable historical document known as the Cyrus Cylinder, a clay artifact inscribed in Babylonian cuneiform and discovered in the 19th century among the ruins of Babylon. The text, written from a Babylonian religious and political perspective, describes Cyrus as chosen by Marduk to correct the failures of the previous regime, and it records his restoration of religious images and practices that Nabonidus had allegedly disrupted. Modern historians generally interpret this document as a carefully crafted piece of political messaging directed specifically at Babylonian audiences and religious authorities, rather than as evidence of some universal or abstract commitment to human rights in a modern sense. The cylinder does, however, reflect a genuinely significant pattern in early Achaemenid governance, a consistent willingness to work within existing local religious and political frameworks, rather than imposing uniform Persian religious or cultural practice across conquered territories. This same pattern of accommodation extended to other populations under Persian control following the Babylonian conquest, most notably communities that had been forcibly relocated to Mesopotamia by earlier conquerors, including Jewish populations exiled from Judah decades earlier by the Babylonians. Biblical tradition, particularly in the books of Ezra and Chronicles, credits Cyrus with permitting these exile communities to return to their homelands and rebuild religious structures, including the Temple in Jerusalem, framing this policy explicitly within a religious narrative present in the Hebrew Bible. Historians generally accept that some form of policy allowing return and religious restoration did occur under Cyrus, though the precise scope, motivation, and administrative mechanics of this policy remain subjects of ongoing scholarly discussion, and its portrayal in religious texts written from a particular theological perspective should be read alongside, rather than as an uncritical substitute for the broader administrative pattern visible across the empire as a whole. What unified these various policies across radically different populations, whether Babylonian priests, exiled Judean communities, or absorbed Median elites, was a consistent Achaemenid governing logic rather than uniform generosity for its own sake. Cyrus and his advisors appear to have recognized that maintaining local religious institutions, existing administrative personnel, and regional elite structures reduced the likelihood of sustained rebellion and made governing an enormously diverse and geographically dispersed empire practically achievable. Direct military occupation of every conquered territory would have required resources and manpower far beyond what any ancient state could realistically sustain across such distances. By instead co-opting local elites and existing institutions into a broader imperial framework held together by loyalty to the Persian king and the payment of tribute, Cyrus created a governing model that could expand rapidly without collapsing under its own administrative weight. Within the Persian homeland itself, Cyrus established a new royal center at Pasargadae, located in the region of Fars, that had long served as the core Persian territory, even before the rise of the wider empire. The site combined formal palace buildings, extensive irrigated gardens, and ceremonial spaces designed to project royal authority to visiting dignitaries and subject populations. Architectural and artistic elements at Pasargadae drew on Median, Elamite, Mesopotamian, and even Anatolian influences, reflecting the multicultural character of the empire Cyrus had assembled even at this early stage, while the location itself, deep within Persian, rather than Median or Babylonian territory, reinforced the message that ultimate authority and dynastic legitimacy remained anchored in Persia specifically, regardless of how far imperial control extended. Cyrus was eventually buried at Pasargadae in a monumental tomb that survives to the present day, a structure that later Persian and even non-Persian rulers would continue to regard with reverence for centuries afterward. Cyrus died in 530 BCE during a military campaign in the empire's eastern territories, in circumstances that ancient sources describe inconsistently and that cannot be fully reconstructed with confidence today. His son Cambyses II succeeded him and directed the bulk of his own military effort toward Egypt, the last major independent power remaining in the eastern Mediterranean world. Cambyses successfully conquered Egypt, incorporating its ancient civilization, agricultural wealth, and strategic Mediterranean coastline into the growing Achaemenid Empire, a significant expansion that brought Persian authority into direct contact with Egyptian religious and administrative traditions stretching back thousands of years. Greek sources, particularly Herodotus, portray Cambyses in a considerably harsher light than his father, describing episodes of impiety toward Egyptian religious customs and erratic personal conduct, though these accounts were written by outsiders working within their own cultural framework and should be treated with the same caution applied to other second-hand ancient narratives. Cambyses died in 522 BCE while returning from Egypt toward the Persian heartland, under circumstances that remain genuinely unclear in the surviving sources, some of which suggest accident and others hint at deliberate action. His death triggered a severe succession crisis, as multiple claimants asserted rights to the throne, and rebellions broke out across several provinces of the empire simultaneously, threatening to unravel the relatively young and still consolidating Achaemenid state entirely. It was within this chaotic environment that Darius, a member of a collateral branch of the Achaemenid royal family, holding a significant but non-royal position, moved decisively to seize the throne, defeating rival claimants and beginning the process of restoring centralized authority across the empire's fractured territories. To justify and permanently record this seizure of power, Darius commissioned an extensive trilingual inscription carved into a cliff face at Behistun in western Iran, accompanied by relief carvings depicting himself triumphant over a row of defeated rebel leaders. The inscription, rendered in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian to reach multiple linguistic audiences across the empire, narrates Darius's version of events, describing a series of impostors and regional rebels whom he suppressed one by one across the empire's provinces in rapid succession during the early years of his reign. Darius presents his victory explicitly as divinely sanctioned, invoking the god Ahura Mazda as the source of his authority and success, a formulation that would become a recurring feature of Achaemenid royal ideology in subsequent inscriptions. Historians recognize the Behistun inscription as an invaluable but inherently self-serving document, one that reveals as much about how Darius wished to be perceived and remembered as it does about the objective sequence of events during this turbulent succession period. Once his position was secured, Darius undertook a substantial reorganization of imperial administration that would define the practical machinery of Achaemenid governance for generations to come. He formally divided the empire into administrative units known as satrapies, each governed by an appointed satrap responsible for local order, justice, and the collection of a fixed tribute assessment owed to the central crown. Satraps were frequently drawn from Persian nobility, and many held significant personal authority within their territories. Yet Darius built oversight mechanisms into the system, including traveling royal inspectors and separate military commanders reporting directly to the king, designed to prevent any single satrap from consolidating dangerous independent power. This structure represented a considerably more systematic approach to imperial administration than the looser, more improvised arrangements of Cyrus's earlier reign, reflecting the practical lessons learned during the chaotic transition following Cambyses' death. By the final years of Darius's early reign, the disparate elements that had come together through Median consolidation, Persian ascendancy, and successive conquests under Cyrus and Cambyses had been welded into a genuinely structured imperial system. What began as scattered Iranian-speaking tribal communities in the highlands and valleys of the plateau had, within roughly a century, produced first a significant Median kingdom, then an even larger Persian-led empire stretching from Egypt to the edges of Central Asia. This transformation did not occur through military conquest alone, but through a combination of calculated absorption of defeated peoples, careful accommodation of local religious and administrative traditions, and increasingly sophisticated governing structures capable of managing extraordinary diversity across vast distances. The foundations established during this period, both the practical machinery of satrapal administration and the underlying political philosophy of managed diversity under centralized Persian authority, would shape the trajectory of Iranian imperial history for centuries to come, setting the stage for the empire's further expansion and its eventual consequential confrontation with the Greek world. Darius the Great's consolidation of power following the suppression of the rebellions recorded at Behistun required more than punishing rivals. It demanded the construction of an administrative system capable of governing a territory that stretched, by the end of his reign, from Egypt and the eastern Mediterranean coast to the Indus Valley in the east. The empire he inherited from Cyrus and Cambyses had grown through rapid conquest, but its internal organization remained uneven, built largely on ad hoc arrangements with local elites rather than a consistent governing structure. Darius addressed this by formally dividing the empire into administrative units known as satrapies, each placed under the authority of a satrap responsible for maintaining order, overseeing justice, and ensuring the regular collection of tribute owed to the central treasury. Ancient sources, including Herodotus, describe roughly 20 such provinces by the height of Darius's reforms, though the exact number and boundaries shifted somewhat over subsequent reigns as the empire adjusted to changing circumstances. Satraps were frequently drawn from the Persian nobility, and many held their positions with a level of local authority that closely resembled kingship within their own territories, commanding regional military forces and managing considerable administrative resources. This arrangement carried an inherent risk, since a sufficiently ambitious or resentful satrap could, in theory, use these same resources to challenge central authority. Darius built specific mechanisms into the system to guard against this danger. Royal inspectors, referred to in later Greek sources somewhat poetically as the king's eyes and ears, traveled through the provinces to monitor satrapal conduct, verify that tribute assessments were being honestly collected and forwarded, and report any signs of disloyalty directly back to the royal court. Military garrison commanders in many provinces answered to the king independently of the satrap's civilian authority, creating a deliberate separation of military and administrative power that reduced the likelihood of any single official consolidating dangerous, unchecked control over a region. This balance between delegated regional authority and centralized oversight distinguished Achaemenid governance from many earlier Near Eastern imperial systems. The Assyrians, for example, had frequently relied on direct military occupation, mass deportation, and harsh punitive measures to maintain control over conquered territories, an approach that generated durable resentment and required constant military reinforcement to sustain. Darius's system, by contrast, sought to make cooperation more attractive and more secure than rebellion for provincial elites, using inspection, calculated garrisoning, and consistent, predictable tribute demands to create incentives for long-term compliance, rather than relying primarily on fear and force. The practical operation of this system depended heavily on infrastructure capable of moving information, resources, and military forces across enormous distances with reasonable speed. The Royal Road, connecting Sardis in western Anatolia to the imperial center at Susa, covered a distance of roughly 1,600 miles and incorporated a network of way stations spaced at intervals, allowing riders to exchange tired horses for fresh ones. Herodotus records that official messages could travel this entire distance in about a week using this relay system, compared to the roughly 3 months such a journey would require on foot without organized support. This infrastructure served purposes well beyond simple communication. It allowed the crown to move troops rapidly in response to rebellion or external threat, transport tax revenue and tribute goods from distant provinces to central treasuries, and maintain a level of administrative coherence across a territory of continental scale that would otherwise have been extraordinarily difficult to sustain. Alongside physical infrastructure, Darius introduced economic standardization measures designed to simplify administration across regions that had previously operated under entirely separate systems of currency, weights, and measurement. The introduction of a standardized gold coin, known to modern scholars as the daric, alongside a corresponding silver coinage, created a more uniform medium for tribute payment and trade across provinces that had previously relied on a patchwork of local currencies and barter arrangements. This standardization did not eliminate regional economic diversity, since local currencies and trade practices continued to operate alongside imperial coinage in many areas, but it provided a common fiscal framework that made calculating, collecting, and transporting tribute considerably more efficient for imperial administrators. Language policy reflected a similarly pragmatic approach to governing a genuinely multi-ethnic empire. Aramaic, already widely used as a language of trade and diplomacy across Mesopotamia and the Levant before the Achaemenid conquests, was adopted as the empire's primary administrative language for correspondence between provinces and the royal court. This choice was practical rather than ideological. Aramaic was already understood by a substantial portion of the empire's literate bureaucratic class, making it far more efficient to adopt an existing widely known language than to impose Old Persian, which lacked the same administrative infrastructure of scribes and existing documentary tradition across such a wide geographic area. Royal inscriptions intended for public and ceremonial purposes, however, were typically rendered in multiple languages simultaneously, including Old Persian, Elamite, and Akkadian, ensuring that different audiences within the empire could each access the king's official pronouncements in a familiar linguistic form. This same spirit of pragmatic accommodation extended into religious policy. The Achaemenid kings did not attempt to impose a single state religion uniformly across their subject territories. Local temples, priesthoods, and religious practices were generally permitted to continue operating much as they had before Persian conquest, provided local populations remained politically loyal and continued paying the tribute assessed to their province. This approach significantly reduced the kind of religious friction that could fuel sustained resistance, allowing the empire to absorb populations with radically different religious traditions, from Egyptian temple cults to Babylonian religious institutions to various Anatolian and Levantine practices, without triggering the kind of systematic unrest that direct religious imposition might have provoked. At the same time, the Achaemenid state did not rely purely on tolerance and accommodation. Deportation and forced resettlement remained tools of imperial control, used deliberately to break apart populations or elite groups considered politically dangerous, relocating them to different regions of the empire where their capacity to organize coordinated resistance was substantially diminished. This dual approach, generally permissive toward everyday religious and cultural practice, but willing to use forceful demographic engineering when political security demanded it, reflects the practical, results-oriented character of Achaemenid administration, rather than any single consistent ideological commitment to either tolerance or control as an end in itself. Zoroastrian religious concepts appear with increasing prominence in Achaemenid royal inscriptions beginning with Darius's reign, particularly the veneration of Ahura Mazda as a supreme deity associated with truth and order, invoked repeatedly as the source of the king's legitimate authority. Historians continue to debate the precise nature of this religious dimension of Achaemenid kingship. Some scholars interpret it as evidence of a genuinely institutionalized Zoroastrian state religion embraced by the royal family, while others argue that it reflects a more personal or dynastic devotion, layered over older, broader Iranian religious traditions that had not yet crystallized into the more formally organized Zoroastrianism that would later develop under the Sasanian Empire many centuries afterward. what can be stated with reasonable confidence is that Achaemenid religious rhetoric consistently linked royal legitimacy to divine sanction, a pattern that would recur in different forms throughout the subsequent history of Iranian kingship. The ceremonial capital of Persepolis, whose construction Darius initiated and which his successors continued to expand over subsequent decades, gave this entire administrative and ideological system a physical, monumental expression. Reliefs carved into the palace walls depict long processions of representatives from across the empire's many subject peoples, each identifiable through distinctive dress and characteristic tribute goods, approaching the enthroned king to offer symbolic submission and material tribute. These images functioned as more than decoration. They constituted a deliberate visual statement of hierarchical unity, presenting the empire's extraordinary ethnic and cultural diversity not as a source of instability, but as a coherent, orderly system centered on and legitimized by Persian kingship. Visiting dignitaries and provincial officials who witnessed these images, whether during formal audiences or ceremonial festivals, would have absorbed a clear ideological message about their place within the broader imperial order. Darius extended Achaemenid military reach through campaigns that pushed the empire's borders to their greatest territorial extent, including expeditions into the Indus Valley region in the east, and a campaign against Scythian tribes north of the Danube River in the west, though this latter expedition achieved only limited and temporary territorial gains, despite its ambitious scope. It was in the empire's western territories, however, along the Aegean coast of Asia Minor, that a far more consequential and enduring conflict began to take shape, one that would eventually draw Persia into direct, sustained confrontation with the Greek mainland. The Greek cities of Ionia, situated along the coast of Asia Minor, had come under Persian control during the reign of Cyrus, following his earlier conquest of Lydia. These cities retained considerable internal political autonomy in daily affairs, but they remained subject to Persian-appointed regional oversight and periodic tribute demands, arrangements that many local populations found increasingly burdensome as decades passed. In 499 BCE, this tension erupted into open rebellion when the Ionian cities, under the initial leadership of Aristagoras of Miletus, rose against Persian authority in what became known as the Ionian Revolt. Aristagoras sought and received limited military support from mainland Greek states, most significantly a modest contingent of ships and soldiers from Athens, along with support from Eretria. This combined Greek force achieved an early symbolic success by marching inland and burning Sardis, the major regional administrative center that had served as the Achaemenid Empire's principal seat of authority in western Anatolia since Cyrus's original conquest of Lydia. Persian forces gradually regrouped, however, and over the following several years methodically reasserted control over the rebellious Ionian cities, culminating in a decisive naval victory near the island of Lade and the eventual full suppression of the revolt by 493 BCE. While the rebellion itself ultimately failed to achieve lasting independence for the Ionian cities, the involvement of Athenian forces in the destruction of Sardis registered strongly at the Achaemenid court as a direct affront requiring eventual retribution. Darius is recorded in several ancient traditions as having taken particular personal offense at Athenian involvement in this episode, and he reportedly began preparing punitive military expeditions against mainland Greece in the years following the revolt's suppression. It is important to understand this Persian motivation accurately, without imposing later Greek historical framing that would present these campaigns primarily as a grand civilizational clash between East and West. from the Achaemenid perspective, the coming conflict represented less an attempt at unprecedented territorial conquest and more a matter of restoring appropriate order and punishing defiance within a broader imperial system that expected consistent loyalty from subject and allied territories alike, treating Athenian interference in Ionia as a violation of that expected order requiring correction. The first major Persian military response, launched around 492 BCE under the command of Darius's son-in-law Mardonius, achieved only limited results and suffered significant disruption when a storm severely damaged the accompanying Persian fleet along the dangerous coastline near Mount Athos. A second, considerably more determined expedition followed in 490 BCE, this time directed by commanders Datis and Artaphernes, culminating in the Battle of Marathon on the plain northeast of Athens. Greek forces, primarily Athenian hoplites, supported by a smaller contingent from Plataea, employed heavier armor and a more cohesive phalanx battle formation than Persian infantry typically utilized, and this tactical advantage, combined with effective Greek battlefield leadership, produced a decisive Persian defeat. From a purely Achaemenid strategic perspective, the defeat at Marathon represented a setback within one peripheral theatre of a vast empire rather than a fundamental threat to the security or stability of Persian rule more broadly. The failure did not provoke any immediate, large-scale reassessment of imperial strategy or priorities at the Achaemenid court, and Darius reportedly began preparing an even larger punitive expedition in response, viewing the defeat as requiring correction rather than reconsideration. He died in 486 BCE, however, before this planned campaign could be launched, leaving the unfinished task, along with the broader unresolved conflict with mainland Greece, to his son and successor, Xerxes I. Xerxes assembled a substantially larger invasion force for his campaign of 480 BCE, drawing troops, naval vessels, and logistical support from across the empire's many satrapies. A mobilization that showcased the genuine administrative and military capacity Achaemenid governance had cultivated over the preceding decades. Herodotus, admittedly prone to exaggeration regarding troop numbers, nonetheless conveys an accurate general impression of the campaign's extraordinary scale and its deliberately multi-ethnic composition, drawing soldiers, sailors, and support personnel from Persian, Median, Egyptian, Phoenician, and numerous other provincial populations. Persian military engineers constructed a bridge of lashed boats across the Hellespont to allow land forces to cross into Europe, and dug a canal through the Athos Peninsula, specifically to avoid the kind of naval disaster that had disrupted the earlier 492 BCE expedition. Logistical achievements that underscore the substantial resources and engineering capability the empire could mobilize for a single campaign. The invasion initially proceeded with considerable Persian success. At Thermopylae, a narrow mountain pass in central Greece, a comparatively small Greek force under the Spartan king Leonidas managed to delay the much larger Persian advance for several days through disciplined defensive fighting in the confined terrain, before local knowledge of an alternate mountain path allowed Persian forces to outflank and ultimately destroy the defending Greek contingent. This delay, while militarily costly for the defenders, provided crucial additional time for other Greek city-states to complete preparations further south. Xerxes subsequently occupied Athens itself, whose population had largely evacuated in anticipation of the Persian advance, and ordered the city burned, an action that achieved the specific symbolic retribution Darius had originally sought for the earlier destruction of Sardis during the Ionian Revolt. The subsequent naval Battle of Salamis, fought in the narrow straits near Athens shortly after the city's occupation, proved decisive in a manner quite different from the preceding land campaign. The confined waterway significantly limited the maneuverability advantages that the larger and more numerous Persian fleet would otherwise have enjoyed in open water, while allowing the more agile Greek ships to fight effectively in tighter formation. The resulting Greek naval victory inflicted serious losses on Persian naval forces and, crucially, threatened the security of Xerxes' supply lines and lines of communication back toward Asia. Xerxes made the strategic decision to return to Persia with a substantial portion of his forces following this defeat, leaving a reduced army under the experienced general Mardonius to continue land operations in Greece through the following campaigning season. The following year, in 479 BCE, combined Greek forces, drawing on contingents from Sparta, Athens, and numerous other city-states in an unusually broad coalition, met and decisively defeated this remaining Persian army at the Battle of Plataea, effectively ending any realistic prospect of continued Persian control over mainland Greek territory. These campaigns are known to modern audiences overwhelmingly through Greek sources, most extensively through Herodotus, whose narrative naturally emphasizes Greek unity, tactical ingenuity, and moral virtue against a Persian force portrayed as numerically overwhelming, but strategically and culturally inferior. Persian administrative records offer essentially no surviving direct counter-narrative to this Greek framing, meaning that any balanced modern assessment of Achaemenid strategic thinking and decision-making during these campaigns must explicitly account for this significant imbalance in surviving historical evidence, rather than accepting the Greek perspective as an objective or complete account of Persian motivations and calculations. Following these military defeats, the Achaemenid Empire did not collapse, retreat into general defensive weakness, or experience any serious internal destabilization as a direct result of the Greek campaign's failure. The empire did, however, permanently abandon any further ambition of achieving direct territorial control over the Greek mainland, redirecting its approach toward the Aegean region through primarily diplomatic and financial means rather than large-scale military invasion. Persian strategy in subsequent decades centered on providing financial subsidies to favored factions within competing Greek city-states, exploiting the persistent and often bitter rivalries between Athens, Sparta, and other Greek powers to maintain meaningful indirect influence over Aegean and Anatolian coastal affairs without further risking large-scale military confrontation. This approach proved remarkably effective for an extended period, allowing Achaemenid Persia to shape the outcomes of Greek internal conflicts, including significant financial support provided to Sparta during the later Peloponnesian War against Athens, achieving strategic objectives through economic leverage that direct military conquest had failed to secure. These wars, despite Persia's eventual strategic accommodation with the Greek world, established a lasting historical narrative, constructed almost entirely from the Greek side of the conflict, portraying a fundamental and enduring struggle between Greek political liberty and Persian imperial despotism. This narrative framework, whatever its historical accuracy or oversimplification, would later be explicitly invoked by Alexander the Great generations afterward as ideological justification for his own invasion of Achaemenid territory, presenting his campaign as righteous retribution for Xerxes' earlier invasion of Greece, rather than straightforward territorial conquest for its own sake. Internally, the Achaemenid court experienced increasing friction over royal succession, and the loyalty of powerful provincial satraps as the 5th century BCE progressed, following these Greek campaigns. Xerxes himself was assassinated in 465 BCE amid palace intrigue involving a court official named Artabanus, and subsequent reigns witnessed recurring struggles between rival royal claimants and provincial governors who, at various points, acted with near-complete autonomy from central royal authority, particularly during moments of succession uncertainty when the crown's attention was necessarily divided. The very administrative system that had granted satraps substantial local power to govern their provinces effectively also created inherent structural vulnerabilities, since a sufficiently ambitious, resentful, or opportunistic governor could potentially mobilize significant regional military and financial resources against the central crown itself, particularly if central authority appeared weakened or divided. These internal pressures did not immediately threaten the Achaemenid Empire's fundamental survival during this period, and the empire continued functioning as the dominant power across the Near East for another century and a half following the Greek campaigns. They did, however, gradually erode the tight, effective coordination between imperial center and provincial periphery that had characterized the more vigorous and closely managed reigns of Cyrus and Darius during the empire's initial formation and consolidation. This slow accumulation of internal administrative and political strain, combined with the permanent western frontier established by the failed Greek campaigns, left the empire structurally more vulnerable to sustained and coordinated external pressure as an entirely new and unanticipated military threat began gathering strength in the north, within the previously peripheral kingdom of Macedon under its ambitious king Philip II, and, following his assassination, his son Alexander. Alexander's invasion of the Achaemenid Empire began in the spring of 334 BCE, when his combined Macedonian and Greek army crossed the Hellespont into Asia Minor, bringing to a head decades of tension between the Greek world and Persian imperial power. His father, Philip II, had spent years building both the military and the political justification for a campaign against Persia, framing it as retribution for Xerxes' invasion of Greece more than a century earlier, and Alexander inherited both this army and this ideological framing upon Philip's assassination in 336 BCE. The force that crossed into Asia combined heavily armored Macedonian infantry, organized into the phalanx formation, elite cavalry units known as the Companions, and various allied and mercenary Greek contingents, producing an army whose internal coordination and standardized training exceeded what most Achaemenid provincial forces could match. Alexander's first major engagement against Persian forces came at the Granicus River in 334 BCE, where local Anatolian satraps, supported by Greek mercenaries serving in Persian employ, attempted to halt the Macedonian advance near the river crossing. The Persian command structure in this battle suffered from poor coordination between the various regional forces involved, and Alexander's cavalry, personally led into direct combat in a style that would become characteristic of his generalship throughout the campaign, broke through Persian lines and secured a decisive victory. This win opened the wealthy coastal cities of Asia Minor to Macedonian control, and many Greek communities along this coast, some the descendants of populations who had once rebelled against Persia during the Ionian Revolt generations earlier, received Alexander's forces with genuine enthusiasm as liberators from Persian rule, rather than as foreign conquerors. The following year brought the first direct confrontation between Alexander and the Achaemenid, King Darius III, at Issus in southeastern Anatolia, in 333 BCE. Darius commanded a substantially larger force than Alexander's army, but he selected a battlefield constrained by geography, a narrow coastal plain that limited his ability to fully deploy his numerical advantage and allowed Macedonian tactical cohesion to matter more than raw troop numbers. When Macedonian forces pressed hard against the Persian center, Darius made the decision to flee the battlefield rather than risk capture or death, abandoning his war chest, his personal chariot, and members of his own family who fell into Macedonian hands. This flight, whatever its immediate tactical justification, carried severe consequences for Darius's standing both among his own nobility and in the broader historical memory of the campaign, establishing an early pattern of battlefield abandonment that would recur at the campaign's decisive confrontation 2 years later. Following Issus, Darius attempted to negotiate a settlement, reportedly offering Alexander significant territorial concessions and a substantial ransom for his captured family members in exchange for ending the campaign. Alexander rejected these terms, making clear that his objective had shifted from punitive raid or limited territorial gain toward complete conquest of the Achaemenid Empire itself. Rather than immediately pursuing Darius into the Persian heartland, however, Alexander demonstrated notable strategic patience by first securing the eastern Mediterranean coastline, including a difficult and lengthy siege of the fortified island city of Tyre, before continuing southward into Egypt. This sequencing served clear strategic purposes. It denied Persian naval forces access to bases along the Levantine coast, secured Alexander's supply lines and rear areas, and brought the wealth and resources of Egypt under his control before he committed to the deeper and riskier advance into Mesopotamia and the Iranian plateau. The decisive confrontation of the entire campaign came in 331 BCE at Gaugamela, in what is now northern Iraq, where Darius had deliberately selected and prepared the battlefield in advance, leveling terrain specifically to maximize the effectiveness of his scythed chariots and to provide clear ground for his numerically superior cavalry forces. Ancient sources describe Persian numbers at Gaugamela as considerably larger than Alexander's army, though modern historians treat the most extreme ancient figures with appropriate skepticism, recognizing that ancient authors frequently inflated enemy troop counts to enhance the achievements of the victorious side. What remains clear from multiple surviving accounts is that Darius commanded a genuinely substantial and diverse force, drawing troops and cavalry contingents from across the empire's eastern satrapies, representing the last major mobilization of Achaemenid military resources on this scale. Alexander employed a tactical approach at Gaugamela that came to be described by later military historians as an oblique advance, deliberately extending his battle line to draw Persian forces out of their carefully prepared central position, creating gaps in the Persian formation that his cavalry could then exploit. When Alexander personally led a concentrated cavalry strike toward the section of the Persian line where Darius himself commanded, the Achaemenid king once again chose to abandon the battlefield rather than risk personal capture, a decision that, regardless of its individual tactical rationale, caused the broader cohesion of the Persian army to collapse rapidly once word of the king's flight spread through the ranks. This second and far more consequential flight effectively ended Achaemenid resistance as a coordinated, empire-wide military effort, even though scattered fighting and regional resistance would continue in various provinces for some time afterward. The military failures at Issus and Gaugamela reflected structural weaknesses within the Achaemenid system that had been accumulating for generations, rather than representing simple tactical misjudgment in either individual battle. Satrapal military forces frequently maintained loyalty to their regional governors as much as to the central crown, a natural consequence of the delegated provincial authority that had made Achaemenid administration so effective in peacetime, but the complicated unified command during moments of genuine military crisis. The empire's continued reliance on massed provincial levies, while capable of producing genuinely large armies, lacked the standardized training, integrated command hierarchy, and combined arms tactical coordination that Macedonian military reforms under Philip II had already thoroughly established decades before Alexander's invasion began. These structural and organizational factors, compounded by Darius's own repeated decisions to prioritize personal survival over battlefield leadership at critical moments, undermined both the practical Persian war effort and the broader psychological authority of Achaemenid kingship, precisely when strong, visible royal leadership was most needed to hold the multi-ethnic empire together. Following the victory at Gaugamela, Alexander advanced into Mesopotamia and occupied Babylon without encountering significant resistance, as local elites within the city calculated that cooperation with the victorious Macedonian forces offered far better prospects than continued loyalty to a demonstrably defeated Achaemenid regime. Susa, another major administrative center of the empire, similarly fell to Alexander's forces with minimal fighting, yielding substantial accumulated Achaemenid treasury reserves that helped fund the continuing campaign. Alexander then marched into the Persian heartland itself and entered Persepolis in early 330 BCE, the ceremonial capital that Darius the Great had begun constructing nearly 2 centuries earlier as the architectural embodiment of Achaemenid imperial ideology. Macedonian forces thoroughly looted the treasuries of Persepolis, with ancient sources reporting that thousands of pack animals were required to transport the accumulated wealth of the Achaemenid court away from the city. Several months after this initial occupation, the palace complex itself was destroyed by fire, an event that ancient sources describe with notable inconsistency regarding both motivation and circumstance. Some accounts frame the burning as calculated retaliation for Xerxes' earlier destruction of Athens during the Greco-Persian Wars, deliberately invoking the ideological justification for the entire campaign. Other accounts describe a more spontaneous decision made during an evening of celebration and heavy drinking, sometimes attributing particular influence to the Athenian courtesan Thais, who reportedly encouraged the burning as symbolic revenge for Persian actions against Greece generations earlier. Still, other sources suggest the fire may have begun through simple accident rather than deliberate intention. Modern historians remain genuinely divided on which explanation, if any single one, most accurately accounts for the event, and this ambiguity should be treated as a legitimate historiographical problem rather than resolved through confident speculation in either direction. What can be stated with certainty is that the destruction of Persepolis marked a definitive symbolic end to Achaemenid ceremonial authority, even though practical administrative structures in many provinces continued functioning with comparatively minimal disruption under new Macedonian oversight. Darius III fled eastward following his flight from Gaugamela, attempting to reach the empire's remaining loyal territories in the eastern satrapies and potentially rally fresh military resistance. He was ultimately betrayed and assassinated by Bessus, one of his own satraps governing Bactria, who then proclaimed himself the legitimate Achaemenid king under the throne name Artaxerxes V. Alexander pursued Bessus deep into the eastern territories of the former empire, eventually capturing and executing him not merely as a defeated military opponent, but specifically as a usurper who had murdered his own legitimate sovereign, a framing that allowed Alexander to position himself as the rightful avenger of Darius and, by extension, as a legitimate successor to a Achaemenid kingship, rather than simply a foreign conqueror who had destroyed the Persian throne through force alone. This strategic positioning shaped Alexander's subsequent policies toward the conquered Persian territories and elite population in ways that generated significant friction within his own army. Alexander began adopting elements of Persian court dress and ceremonial practice, retained numerous Persian satraps and administrative officials in their existing positions of authority, and worked deliberately to integrate Persian nobility into his expanding imperial court structure, placing Macedonian military garrisons alongside these retained officials primarily to ensure security and loyalty, rather than to replace Persian administrative expertise entirely. His marriage to Roxana, a noblewoman from Bactria, and his later marriages to Persian royal women, descended from the Achaemenid dynasty itself, reinforced this broader strategy of deliberate fusion between Macedonian and Iranian ruling elites, an approach intended to create a more stable, unified governing class across his newly conquered territories. This policy of integration provoked substantial resentment among Alexander's own Macedonian officers and veteran soldiers, many of whom viewed these accommodations to Persian custom as a troubling betrayal of distinctly Greek and Macedonian cultural identity, and who resented sharing military rank, court status, and royal favor with former enemies whom they had spent years fighting to defeat. This tension surfaced repeatedly during the later years of Alexander's campaign, including notable incidents of open confrontation between Alexander and segments of his own army over these very policies, illustrating that the integration of conquered Persian elites into the new imperial structure remained a genuinely contested and unresolved question throughout the remainder of Alexander's life, rather than a settled or universally accepted policy. Alexander's death in Babylon in 323 BCE, reportedly from illness following a period of fever, occurred before he had established any clear or universally accepted mechanism for succession, having left no designated adult heir capable of immediately assuming control over the vast territories he had conquered. This absence of clear succession triggered a prolonged and often violent period of conflict among his surviving generals, generally known to historians as the Wars of the Successors, as these former subordinates fought one another for control over different portions of Alexander's fragmented empire across several decades. These conflicts ultimately produced several competing Hellenistic successor kingdoms, with the Iranian plateau and Mesopotamia eventually falling under the control of Seleucus I Nicator, one of Alexander's most capable former generals, who established what became known as the Seleucid dynasty. Seleucid governance over the Iranian plateau maintained substantial continuity with earlier Achaemenid administrative practices, including the retention of satrapal-style provincial governance and established tribute collection systems, while simultaneously introducing new elements of Hellenistic political and cultural life, most notably the deliberate founding of Greek-style cities, known as polis, that served as centers of Hellenistic culture, administration, and military settlement across the region. These new urban foundations created a genuinely layered social structure across much of Seleucid Iran, in which Greek and Macedonian colonists frequently occupied privileged positions within these newly established cities, enjoying particular legal and civic status, while indigenous Iranian populations, especially in rural agricultural areas and more peripheral regions of the empire, continued older established patterns of local governance, religious practice, and social organization that remained largely unaffected by the change in dynastic overlordship at the imperial level. Seleucid authority over the Iranian plateau gradually weakened across the following century, a decline driven by several compounding factors rather than any single decisive cause. The empire's enormous geographic extent, stretching from Anatolia to the borders of India, made consistent central administration and military coordination genuinely difficult to sustain over such vast distances using the technology and infrastructure available at the time. Recurring and often costly conflicts with the rival Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt over control of the Levantine coast diverted substantial Seleucid military and financial resources away from the empire's eastern territories. This combination of overextension and competing strategic priorities created growing opportunities for regional challengers to establish increasingly independent bases of power along the empire's more distant frontiers, particularly in the less closely supervised eastern satrapies of the Iranian plateau. It was within this context of gradually loosening Seleucid control that a nomadic Iranian people known as the Pani, originally part of a broader confederation of Central Asian steppe peoples, moved into the region of Parthia in northeastern Iran around the middle of the 3rd century BCE, under the leadership of a chieftain named Arsaces. This group established an independent territorial base that gradually evolved from a regional frontier power into what would become the Parthian Empire, also known to historians as the Arsacid dynasty in recognition of its founding leader. In its earliest decades, this new Parthian state operated primarily as a regional power along the Seleucid Empire's increasingly poorly supervised eastern frontier, expanding steadily and largely unchallenged, while Seleucid strategic attention remained concentrated on more pressing Mediterranean and Levantine affairs. Parthian expansion accelerated dramatically under the long and highly successful reign of Mithridates I during the middle decades of the 2nd century BCE. Mithridates extended Parthian control substantially westward, ultimately capturing the wealthy region of Mesopotamia and establishing Parthian authority in the immediate vicinity of the old Seleucid administrative center at Seleucia, near which the Parthians would eventually develop their own significant capital influence at the neighboring city of Ctesiphon. This westward expansion transformed the Parthian state from a regional frontier power into a genuinely major empire commanding territory stretching across much of the former Achaemenid heartland, positioning it as the primary successor power to both Achaemenid and, more immediately, Seleucid authority across Iran and Mesopotamia. The political and administrative structure of this emerging Parthian state differed substantially from both the centralized Achaemenid model established under Darius and the Hellenistic administrative framework the Seleucids had maintained. Political authority under the Arsacid dynasty depended heavily on the cooperation and support of powerful noble families, who controlled extensive hereditary landed estates and maintained substantial private military retinues, creating a genuinely decentralized feudal-style political arrangement in which the reigning king's practical authority depended significantly on successfully maintaining alliances and cooperative relationships with these great aristocratic houses, rather than exercising the kind of direct bureaucratic control over provincial administration that Darius's satrapal system had established centuries earlier. This structural arrangement provided the Parthian state with considerable resilience against external military threats, since defeating the reigning king in a single battle did not necessarily collapse the broader administrative and military system built around these powerful noble houses. It also, however, created recurring instability during succession disputes, since rival branches of the Arsacid royal family could draw upon competing noble house support to contest the throne, producing a pattern of periodic internal conflict that would recur throughout Parthian history. Parthian culture itself reflected a genuine and sustained synthesis between Hellenistic and older Iranian cultural elements, a blending clearly visible in surviving Parthian coinage, which frequently combined Greek language inscriptions and stylistic conventions with distinctly Iranian royal imagery and symbolism. Religious practice under Parthian rule similarly maintained clear continuity with earlier Zoroastrian and older Mesopotamian religious traditions, particularly within the Iranian heartland regions, while established Hellenistic cultural and religious influence persisted within the empire's urban centers, particularly those cities founded or substantially developed during the preceding Seleucid period. The Parthian Empire's most consequential and enduring external relationship developed through its long rivalry with the expanding power of Rome, as both empires came to regard Mesopotamia and the upper Euphrates region as a critical strategic buffer zone, separating their respective spheres of direct control. This prolonged rivalry produced one of the most significant military disasters in Roman history at the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BCE, when a Parthian force built primarily around heavily armored cataphract shock cavalry, combined with highly mobile horse archers capable of sustained ranged attack, decisively destroyed a substantial Roman army under the command of Marcus Licinius Crassus, inflicting catastrophic casualties and capturing Roman military standards in a defeat that profoundly shocked Roman political and military leadership. This victory demonstrated conclusively that Parthian military technology and battlefield tactics, particularly this specific combination of heavy shock cavalry and sustained horse archery employed at range, could effectively counter and defeat traditional Roman legionary infantry formations under favorable battlefield conditions, forcing Roman strategic planners to treat the eastern frontier with considerably greater caution in subsequent decades. Despite recurring military conflicts between Rome and Parthia across the following centuries, including periods during which Roman forces temporarily managed to capture the Parthian capital region around Ctesiphon itself, neither empire ultimately achieved a permanent, lasting conquest of the other's core territorial base. The frontier between Roman and Parthian spheres of influence, and later between Roman and Sasanian spheres following the Parthian Empire's eventual collapse, remained a persistent and genuinely contested zone of shifting control for centuries, shaping the strategic priorities and military development of both empires throughout this extended period. Religious life across Parthian territory reflected the empire's broader pattern of political and administrative pluralism, rather than any centralized enforcement of a single religious tradition. Zoroastrian religious practice continued as a significant presence, particularly within Iranian heartland regions, though without the kind of institutionalized clerical hierarchy and formal religious infrastructure that would later characterize the subsequent Sasanian state. Communities practicing older Babylonian religious traditions, various forms of Hellenistic religious and philosophical practice, and eventually early Christian and Jewish. Religious communities all existed within different regions of Parthian territory with considerable local autonomy, a pattern of religious diversity that closely mirrored the broader political reality of noble house autonomy characterizing Parthian governance more generally. By the early 3rd century CE, the structural weaknesses inherent in this decentralized Parthian political system had become increasingly apparent and increasingly difficult to manage effectively. Repeated succession disputes between competing Arsacid claimants progressively weakened central royal authority, while the practical near independence of powerful regional noble families made coordinated response to both internal political challenges and external military pressure increasingly difficult to organize and sustain. It was within this environment of gradually fragmenting central authority that a new and ultimately decisive challenge emerged from within Persis, the same region that had originally produced the Achaemenid dynasty many centuries earlier, where a local ruler named Ardashir began methodically consolidating regional power and eventually openly challenging established Arsacid authority. This regional Persian resurgence, drawing deliberately and explicitly on historical memory of pre-Parthian Iranian kingship, would ultimately culminate in the complete overthrow of the last reigning Parthian king and the establishment of an entirely new imperial dynasty explicitly seeking to restore the kind of centralized royal authority that the Achaemenids had once wielded, marking the historically significant transition from Parthian rule to the Sasanian era that would follow. In 224 CE, Ardashir I, a regional ruler from the province of Persis in southwestern Iran, defeated and killed Artabanus IV, the last reigning Parthian king, in a decisive battle that ended more than 4 centuries of Arsacid rule and established a new imperial dynasty that would come to be called Sasanian, after Ardashir's grandfather, Sasan. Ardashir's family had held hereditary custodianship of a fire temple dedicated to the goddess Anahita at Istaka, a position that gave them established religious and social standing within the region, long before their rise to political prominence. And this background would shape how the new dynasty approached questions of legitimacy, religious authority, and the relationship between crown and faith throughout its subsequent history. Ardashir began his political career as a local vassal ruler within the broader Parthian imperial system, but he gradually expanded his territorial base across Persis and neighboring regions before openly challenging Arsacid authority, exploiting the structural weaknesses that had accumulated within the decentralized Parthian political order over the preceding decades. Unlike the Parthians, whose authority had rested substantially on negotiated cooperation with powerful, semi-independent noble houses, Ardashir pursued a deliberate program of political centralization aimed at concentrating meaningfully greater authority directly in the hands of the crown. This shift did not eliminate the Iranian aristocracy as a political force, since noble families continued to wield considerable regional influence throughout Sasanian history, but it fundamentally reoriented the relationship between central royal authority and provincial nobility toward a system of greater royal oversight and more direct crown involvement in provincial governance than the Parthians had generally maintained. This centralizing impulse was supported by a parallel and equally deliberate effort to anchor Sasanian political legitimacy within a considerably more clearly defined and institutionally organized religious framework than had existed under Parthian rule. Central to this new framework was the elevation of Zoroastrianism from a broadly practiced but institutionally loose Iranian religious tradition into a formally organized state religion possessing genuine institutional structure and clerical hierarchy. Ardashir enlisted the support of a high priest named Tansa, who helped construct ideological justification for the dynasty's rise to power and began the significant project of compiling a more standardized version of the Avesta, the core body of Zoroastrian sacred texts, drawing together the varied oral traditions and scattered written fragments that had circulated across different Iranian regions during the preceding centuries. This process of religious codification served a clear and deliberate political purpose beyond simple religious organization. A unified scripture and an organized clergy operating under direct royal patronage substantially reinforced the broader ideological claim that the Sasanian king ruled over the material world by precisely the same divine sanction that Ahura Mazda held over the spiritual and cosmic order, creating a mutually reinforcing relationship between religious and political authority. Surviving royal inscriptions from this formative period consistently present Sasanian kings as deriving their authority directly and explicitly from divine sanction, a formulation considerably more explicit and more consistently maintained throughout subsequent reigns than similar, somewhat less systematically developed, Achaemenid-era religious claims had been many centuries earlier. This process of religious institutionalization deepened significantly during the reign of Bahram I and continued under his successors through the influential figure of Kurdir, a priest who served multiple Sasanian kings across several decades during the latter half of the 3rd century CE, and who left behind his own inscriptions detailing his religious and political activities. Kurdir substantially expanded the organizational reach of the Zoroastrian clergy, establishing religious seminaries known as Herbadestan that trained successive generations of priests and worked deliberately to reinforce a specific, officially sanctioned interpretation of Zoroastrian doctrine across the empire, actively working to suppress rival interpretations that clerical authorities considered heretical or doctrinally problematic. Kurdir treated competing religious movements as genuine threats to both religious orthodoxy and broader political order, a stance that contributed directly to periodic state action against various minority religious groups, most notably the Manichaeans, whose founder Mani had developed a syncretic religious teaching drawing on Zoroastrian, Christian, and Buddhist elements, and who was ultimately executed during the reign of Bahram I, an outcome in which clerical pressure from figures such as Kurdir appears to have played a significant contributing role. This growing entanglement between organized priesthood and reigning crown provided Zoroastrian clergy with substantial and sustained influence over broader Sasanian governance and policy, but it simultaneously created an important structural tension that would recur throughout Sasanian history. Reigning kings depended significantly on priestly endorsement and cooperation to maintain their claimed religious legitimacy. Yet, an increasingly empowered and institutionally organized clergy could, in turn, meaningfully constrain royal authority or actively push individual rulers towards specific policies, including periodic religious persecution of minority faiths that served clerical institutional interests as much as, or sometimes more than, broader considerations of state security or political stability. Sasanian provincial administration retained satrapal-style governance structures inherited from earlier Iranian imperial traditions stretching back through the Parthians to the Achaemenids, but Ardashir and his immediate successors worked deliberately to bring provincial administration under noticeably firmer central supervision than the Parthians had generally achieved, meaningfully reducing the practical autonomy of great noble houses relative to the crown. Even though these established aristocratic families remained a genuinely powerful and politically significant presence throughout the entire span of Sasanian history, Sasanian society was organized into distinct and formally recognized social classes, generally described in surviving sources as encompassing priests, warriors, scribes, and administrative bureaucrats, and commoners primarily engaged in agriculture and commerce, with movement between these established social categories heavily restricted by both religious doctrine and enforced legal custom. This stratified social structure, reinforced simultaneously by religious teaching and formal legal tradition, provided meaningful social stability across much of the empire's roughly 4-century existence, though it also entrenched considerable noble privilege in ways that periodically produced significant friction with royal centralizing efforts, particularly during recurring succession disputes, when competing royal claimants actively sought noble military and financial support to secure their respective claims to the throne. Sasanian foreign policy centered overwhelmingly and consistently on the long-running rivalry with Rome, and, following the 4th century CE, its Byzantine successor state, a rivalry that persisted with only intermittent negotiated truces across nearly the entire span of Sasanian imperial history. Early Sasanian kings, including both Ardashir himself and his son and successor Shapur I, achieved several notable and significant military successes against Roman forces along the contested frontier regions. Most dramatically, Shapur I captured the reigning Roman Emperor Valerian in battle during the 260s CE, a genuinely extraordinary military and diplomatic achievement that Sasanian propagandists commemorated prominently in monumental rock reliefs carved into cliff faces, explicitly presenting the event as clear demonstration of divinely sanctioned Persian superiority over Rome. These prolonged wars continued across subsequent centuries, with shifting fortunes favoring first one side and then the other, generally centered on contested control of frontier regions in Mesopotamia, Armenia, and the broader Caucasus region, areas whose strategic and economic importance made them recurring flashpoints throughout the entire conflict. Under Khosrow I, during the 6th century CE, the Sasanian state underwent significant and far-reaching administrative and military reform, including a substantial reorganization of provincial defense structures and meaningful revisions to the underlying land tax system that had previously governed imperial revenue collection. These reforms measurably strengthened the empire's practical capacity to sustain prolonged military campaigns and contributed directly to an extended period of relative internal stability and generally effective centralized governance that many historians regard as representing something of a high point in overall Sasanian administrative achievement and institutional development. The subsequent reign of Khosrow II in the early 7th century CE initially produced the single most extensive Sasanian territorial gains achieved in many generations, as Persian military forces successfully exploited significant internal Byzantine political instability to capture Byzantine-controlled Syria, Palestine, and Egypt in a rapid and remarkably successful series of campaigns, temporarily extending direct Sasanian authority all the way to the shores of the Mediterranean Sea for the first time since the earliest Achaemenid period many centuries earlier. This dramatic success, however, proved entirely unsustainable in the longer term. The Byzantine Emperor Heraclius, facing an existential threat to his empire's core territories, undertook a thorough reorganization of available Byzantine military and financial resources and subsequently launched a sustained and increasingly aggressive counteroffensive that eventually penetrated deep into Sasanian territory itself, ultimately threatening the Persian imperial heartland directly and forcing a comprehensive Sasanian military withdrawal from all previously conquered Byzantine territory across the Levant and Egypt. This prolonged conflict eventually concluded through a negotiated peace settlement that essentially restored pre-war territorial boundaries between the two exhausted empires. But the true underlying cost of this decades-long war fell heavily on both empires' broader internal capacity and institutional resilience, thoroughly exhausting royal treasuries, significantly depleting experienced military manpower on both sides, and substantially destabilizing the domestic political systems of both states at precisely the moment when an entirely unanticipated new power was beginning to consolidate rapidly within Arabia, a development neither exhausted empire was well positioned to recognize or effectively counter. Sasanian religious policy toward the various minority religious communities present within imperial territory varied considerably depending on shifting political circumstances, rather than following any single consistent approach maintained uniformly across the entire dynasty's extended history. Christian communities, particularly concentrated within Sasanian Mesopotamia, generally experienced alternating periods of relative official tolerance interspersed with episodes of more active persecution, with this pattern often correlating closely with the current state of broader Sasanian-Byzantine relations. Since Byzantine Christianity's status as the official state religion of Sasanian Persia's primary imperial rival sometimes cast domestic Sasanian Christian communities under considerable official suspicion regarding potentially divided political loyalties. Jewish communities established within Mesopotamia generally experienced comparatively more stable and consistent conditions throughout the Sasanian period, and this era saw genuinely significant development of rabbinic religious scholarship, including substantial foundational work on what became known as the Babylonian Talmud. Occurring within a broadly tolerant Sasanian administrative and legal environment that permitted considerable communal autonomy, Manichaean religious communities, and later the related Mazdakite religious and social movement that emerged during the 5th century CE, faced more consistently hostile state treatment throughout Sasanian history, particularly whenever their respective teachings were perceived by religious and political authorities as directly challenging the established social hierarchy or the orthodox Zoroastrian doctrinal framework that fundamentally underpinned Sasanian royal legitimacy. Though even here, the actual intensity of state persecution varied considerably, depending on individual reign and immediate political context, rather than following any single uniform policy consistently applied across the entire period. The Islamic conquest of Sasanian Persia developed with genuinely remarkable speed following the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632 CE and the rapid subsequent consolidation of the Rashidun Caliphate under his immediate successors as leaders of the expanding Muslim community. Arab Muslim military forces, initially probing cautiously along Sasanian frontier territories in Mesopotamia, encountered an empire already severely weakened by the recently concluded and mutually exhausting Byzantine War, and further, destabilized by ongoing succession instability following Khosrow II's assassination in 628 CE, an event that had subsequently produced a rapid and destabilizing succession of short-reigning claimants to the Sasanian throne over the following several years. This combination of external military exhaustion and internal political instability left this Sasanian state considerably less capable of mounting an effective, coordinated defense than it might otherwise have managed under more stable circumstances. The decisive military confrontation of this early conquest phase came at the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah, generally dated by most historians to 636 CE, where Arab Muslim forces under the command of Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas decisively defeated a substantially larger Sasanian army in a hard-fought engagement, whose outcome effectively opened the entirety of Mesopotamia to advancing Arab control. This significant victory forced the immediate abandonment of the Sasanian imperial capital at Ctesiphon, which fell to Arab forces shortly afterward, representing an early and genuinely severe blow to Sasanian imperial prestige and practical military capacity. Sasanian resistance to the advancing Arab conquest did not collapse immediately or completely following this initial defeat at Qadisiyah. Yazdegerd III, the last reigning Sasanian king, retreated eastward from the collapsing western provinces and worked energetically to raise fresh military forces drawn from across the remaining loyal Iranian provinces, eventually assembling a substantial army that met advancing Arab forces at the Battle of Nahavand in 642 CE. This subsequent battle, later remembered within broader Islamic historical tradition as the victory of victories, proved even more comprehensively decisive than the earlier engagement at Qadisiyah, effectively destroying the last significant coordinated Sasanian military resistance and definitively opening the entire Iranian plateau to systematic and largely unopposed Arab conquest over the following several years. Historians generally identify multiple overlapping contributing causes for this remarkably rapid Sasanian collapse, rather than pointing to any single sufficient explanation. These factors include the empire's severe underlying exhaustion, resulting from the recently concluded Byzantine War, chronic succession instability that had substantially undermined effective central authority during the years immediately preceding the Arab conquest, significant friction between an increasingly rigid social hierarchy and various segments of the broader population, who evidently saw comparatively limited practical benefit in mounting a determined defense of that existing social order, and the notable tactical adaptability demonstrated by Arab military forces, who possessed considerable practical experience in mobile desert warfare against a Sasanian military establishment still organized primarily around more traditional and less flexible battlefield formations. Yazdegerd III continued fleeing steadily eastward through the remaining Iranian provinces for several additional years following the defeat at Nahavand, attempting without ultimate success to rally sufficient remaining support to meaningfully reverse the ongoing conquest, until he was eventually killed near the city of Merv in 651 CE. Under circumstances that historical sources indicate involved local betrayal rather than direct battlefield defeat, an ending that effectively symbolized the broader and final collapse of centralized Sasanian royal authority into scattered, ultimately futile local resistance, followed by eventual comprehensive submission to Arab rule across the entire former imperial territory. The Arab conquest of Persia did not produce instant or uniform religious conversion to Islam across the vast Iranian plateau, a process that instead unfolded gradually across many subsequent centuries rather than occurring rapidly in the immediate aftermath of military conquest. Significant Zoroastrian religious communities persisted, particularly within more remote and less closely administered regions of the former empire, for many generations following the initial conquest, maintaining traditional religious practice despite the fundamental change in overall political authority. Facing gradually increasing social, legal, and economic pressure over subsequent centuries, some Zoroastrian communities eventually chose to migrate away from Iran entirely, most significantly to India, where their descendants became known historically as the Parsis, successfully preserving traditional Zoroastrian religious practice outside their original Iranian homeland and continuing this distinct religious tradition into the modern era. The fall of the Sasanian Empire marked a genuine and historically significant rupture within the broader trajectory of Iranian political history, definitively ending nearly a full millennium of continuous native Iranian imperial rule stretching back through the Parthians to the original Achaemenids, and replacing this long tradition of indigenous Iranian kingship with governance under an Arab Islamic caliphate centered far to the west in Arabia and later Mesopotamia. Yet this significant historical rupture was not entirely absolute in every meaningful respect. Persian administrative expertise, established bureaucratic practice, and numerous elements of pre-Islamic Iranian culture did not simply vanish following the conquest, but were instead gradually absorbed into the developing new Islamic political order over subsequent generations, setting the stage for an extended and genuinely complex process, extending across several subsequent centuries, through which distinct Iranian identity would be substantially reshaped within a new Islamic religious and political framework, rather than being simply erased or entirely replaced by it, a dynamic historical process that would come to define the subsequent period of Iranian history in fundamental ways. In the aftermath of the Sasanian collapse, the Umayyad and later Abbasid caliphates faced the practical challenge of governing a vast conquered territory whose administrative traditions far predated Islam itself by many centuries. Rather than dismantling the existing Persian bureaucratic apparatus that had developed under Sasanian rule, both caliphates absorbed it directly, retaining former Sasanian officials, established tax registers, and long-standing provincial governance patterns as genuinely functional tools of empire rather than replacing them wholesale with entirely new administrative systems. This practical dependence on inherited Persian administrative expertise reached its clearest and most consequential expression under the Abbasid Caliphate, formally established in 750 CE, whose new capital at Baghdad sat in close geographic proximity to the ruins of the old Sasanian imperial center at Ctesiphon, and whose governing apparatus relied heavily and increasingly on capable Persian bureaucratic families to manage day-to-day imperial administration across a caliphate that had grown far too large for any small governing elite to administer alone. The Barmakid family exemplified this pattern of Persian administrative influence within the early Abbasid Caliphate in particularly striking fashion. Originally, a Persian family connected to Buddhist religious administration in the city of Balkh, before their eventual conversion to Islam, the Barmakids rose to extraordinary political influence as viziers serving several successive Abbasid caliphs, managing state finance, provincial administration, and significant aspects of caliphal governance across multiple decades. Their influence continued until a sudden and dramatic fall from favor under Caliph Harun al-Rashid in 803 CE, when the caliph abruptly ordered the arrest and execution of key Barmakid family members, an episode whose precise underlying causes remain debated among historians, but whose broader significance is clear enough. The episode demonstrated both the genuine depth of Persian administrative influence achieved within the highest levels of caliphal governance during this period, and simultaneously the fundamental precariousness of that influence whenever it appeared, in the eyes of the reigning caliph, to potentially rival or threaten the caliph's own personal authority. Conversion to Islam across the broader Iranian plateau unfolded gradually over the course of several centuries following the initial Arab conquest, rather than occurring as an immediate or uniform consequence of that conquest itself. Zoroastrian religious communities persisted in genuinely significant numbers well into the Abbasid period, particularly within rural agricultural areas and regions situated at some distance from the major new administrative centers established under Islamic rule. Taxation policy under this new Islamic administration, which imposed additional financial levies specifically on non-Muslim subjects through the jizya tax system, created a gradual and cumulative economic incentive favoring eventual conversion over time, functioning as a slow, structural pressure, rather than representing any policy of immediate forced religious conversion during most periods of early Islamic rule over Iran. This considerably slower and more genuinely negotiated pattern of gradual Islamization distinguished the broader Iranian historical experience from patterns observed in some other territories conquered during the initial wave of early Islamic expansion, and this extended timeline coincided meaningfully with the parallel survival of Persian language and established administrative culture in ways that ultimately allowed pre-Islamic Iranian identity to persist through the conquest period and eventually reassert itself with growing confidence within a broader Islamic political and religious framework, rather than simply disappearing beneath it entirely. By the 9th century CE, direct Abbasid central authority over its more distant eastern territories had already begun weakening considerably, opening meaningful political space for regional dynasties of genuinely Iranian origin to establish increasingly autonomous local rule, while still formally acknowledging the reigning Abbasid caliph's overarching religious supremacy as leader of the broader Muslim community. The Samanid dynasty, ruling from their capital at Bukhara over the broader regions of Khorasan and Transoxiana, beginning in the 9th century, played a particularly significant and lasting role in this developing process by actively and deliberately sponsoring the revival of the Persian language in formal written literary form, directly commissioning and supporting production of some of the earliest substantial works of New Persian poetry and prose composed under direct royal court patronage. Further to the west, the Buyid dynasty, despite originating from a somewhat different regional background within Iran, successfully took direct control of Baghdad itself by 945 CE and subsequently exercised genuinely effective practical political power over the nominally reigning Abbasid Caliph, who remained formally in place but was substantially reduced to a largely symbolic religious role. The Buyids deliberately revived the ancient Sasanian royal title of Shahanshah, meaning King of Kings, employing this historically loaded title as an explicit and quite deliberate symbolic gesture that directly linked their own contemporary political rule to the earlier tradition of pre-Islamic Persian imperial kingship. This extended period, sometimes described by modern historians as the Iranian intermezzo, represented a deliberate and increasingly confident reassertion of distinct Persian cultural and political identity, operating within a broader Islamic religious context, achieved not through any rejection of Islam itself, but rather through its creative and confident integration alongside revived Iranian symbols, historical memory, and linguistic tradition. The single most consequential cultural product of this broader Persian revival emerged from the sustained literary effort of Abul Qasim Ferdowsi, a Persian poet from the city of Tus in the region of Khorasan, who spent well over 3 decades of his life composing the Shahnameh, or Book of Kings, a massive epic poem finally completed around the year 1010 CE. Drawing extensively on earlier Sasanian-era chronicles alongside surviving oral historical traditions, Ferdowsi constructed a sweeping narrative epic tracing the full arc of Iranian kingship, from its earliest mythical origins all the way through the historical fall of the Sasanian Empire centuries earlier, deliberately working to preserve pre-Islamic Persian historical memory, distinctive language, and traditional cultural values at a specific historical moment, when Arabic remained the clearly dominant language of religious scholarship and formal administrative life across most of the broader Islamic world. Ferdowsi composed this massive work almost entirely in Persian, rather than choosing to write in Arabic, a deliberate linguistic choice that later scholars have consistently identified as genuinely instrumental in helping ensure that the Persian language successfully survived and subsequently flourished as a major literary language in its own right, representing a form of linguistic continuity that meaningfully distinguished the Iranian historical experience from many other regions conquered during the earlier wave of Islamic expansion, where indigenous local languages were generally displaced far more thoroughly and completely by advancing Arabic. The Shahname's eventual completion coincided closely with a significant change in available political patronage, as the previously supportive Samanid dynasty collapsed during this same period, and Ferdowsi ultimately found himself dedicating his finished life's work to Sultan Mahmud of Ghazni, a powerful ruler of Turkic slave soldier origin, whose committed Sunni religious orthodoxy sat somewhat uneasily alongside the epic's clearly romanticized and reverent vision of ancient pre-Islamic Persian monarchy and kingship. Mahmud's Ghaznavid dynasty represented an early and genuinely significant instance of a much broader historical pattern that would recur repeatedly throughout the following several centuries of Iranian history. Political and direct military authority increasingly passing into the hands of Turkic dynasties of Central Asian origin, while Persian language, established administrative practice, and rich cultural production continued to flourish and develop under their continued patronage. This particular pattern intensified quite dramatically with the subsequent rise of the Seljuk Turks, who migrated westward from Central Asia and successfully established control over most of Iran, along with much of the wider Middle East, by roughly the middle of the 11th century CE. The Seljuks governed their newly acquired territories through a genuinely hybrid administrative system that effectively combined Turkic military leadership at the highest levels with established Persian bureaucratic administration handling most practical governance, most notably and effectively under the influential vizier Nizam al-Mulk, whose detailed administrative treatise on proper governance, along with his extensive personal patronage of religious education through newly established religious colleges known as madrasas, shaped Islamic institutional and educational life across the broader region for many generations afterward. This clear division of governing function, in which Turkic dynasties consistently supplied top military and political leadership, while Persian officials, established scholars, and celebrated poets maintained practical administrative continuity and rich ongoing cultural production, became a genuinely durable and recurring governing formula across much of the medieval Iranian world for centuries to come. This extended period also produced significant and lasting achievements in mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and poetry that clearly reflected the continued intellectual vitality of Persian culture, even while operating under sustained Turkic political rule. Omar Khayyam, active during the late 11th and early 12th centuries, successfully combined serious scholarly work in mathematics and astronomy with poetry that later became widely known and celebrated well beyond Iran's borders through subsequent translation, exemplifying this era's genuine capacity to sustain sophisticated intellectual and artistic culture despite ongoing political fragmentation and periodic military upheaval throughout the wider region. Persian remained firmly established as the dominant language of literary expression and administrative life across the entire Iranian plateau, and extended well into neighboring regions, including significant parts of Central Asia and the northern Indian subcontinent, establishing a cultural and linguistic footprint considerably larger in geographic scope than the actual political boundaries controlled by any single Iranian dynasty during this particular historical period. This broader trajectory of gradual cultural recovery and confident consolidation was violently and catastrophically disrupted by the Mongol invasions beginning in the 1220s under the command of Genghis Khan. Mongol military forces thoroughly devastated major established Iranian cities, including Nishapur, Merv, and Herat, employing systematic and deliberate destruction alongside mass killing on a scale that produced genuinely severe long-term demographic and economic damage across the entire Iranian plateau. fundamentally disrupting centuries-old established patterns of urban life, agricultural infrastructure, and regional trade networks that had developed gradually over many preceding generations. Contemporary chroniclers writing during this period described the deliberate destruction of sophisticated irrigation systems that had successfully sustained agricultural productivity across the region for many generations, damage whose severe practical effects persisted for a considerable time, long after the initial invasion itself had passed through the region. Following further sustained Mongol military campaigns conducted under Genghis Khan's various successors, Iran eventually came under the more settled administrative rule of the Ilkhanate, formally established by Hulagu Khan during the 1250s as a Mongol successor state governing Iran, Iraq, and various surrounding territories under continued Mongol dynastic authority. Ilkhanid rule initially represented explicitly non-Muslim governance imposed over a predominantly Muslim subject population, a genuinely novel and historically unusual political situation for the broader region, one without meaningful precedent since the original 7th century Islamic conquest many centuries earlier. Over the course of several succeeding generations, however, the ruling Ilkhanid dynasty underwent a gradual and progressive process of cultural and religious assimilation into their predominantly Muslim subject population, a process culminating in the formal conversion of the ruler Ghazan Khan to Islam during the 1290s, followed subsequently by his eventual successor, Oljetu's later adoption of Twelver Shia Islam, specifically during the early 14th century. This particular religious decision by Oljetu, while not immediately or permanently establishing broader Shia religious dominance across Iran at that specific historical moment, nonetheless clearly demonstrated the increasing practical presence and genuine political viability of various Shia religious currents already developing within Iranian territory, well before the later Safavid period would ultimately transform this religious landscape more permanently and comprehensively. Despite the severe initial devastation inflicted by the original invasion, the Mongol and subsequently Ilkhanid rulers eventually became genuinely significant patrons of Persian artistic and literary culture, actively commissioning substantial historical and literary works, supporting continued Persian language administration throughout their territories, and generally overseeing an extended period of renewed, though admittedly uneven, cultural production. Once the most immediate and severe destruction caused by the original invasion had substantially passed, the Ilkhanate itself eventually fragmented into competing successor territories during the middle decades of the 14th century, and the following century brought yet further significant upheaval to the region under the conqueror Timur, who launched several additional destructive military campaigns across Iranian territory before ultimately establishing his own Timurid dynasty, whose most significant and lasting cultural achievements centered primarily on major Central Asian cities such as Herat and Samarkand, rather than on the Iranian plateau itself directly. Following Timur's eventual death, Iran subsequently experienced a prolonged period of considerable political fragmentation among various competing regional Turkic and Turkic-Mongol dynasties, including the Kara-Koyunlu and Ak-Koyunlu tribal confederations, with no single dominant power managing to achieve lasting unification of the broader Iranian plateau throughout the entirety of the 15th century. This extended period of political fragmentation ultimately created the specific historical conditions in which an entirely new religious and political movement could eventually emerge with sufficient strength to unify Iran under a distinctly different ideological foundation than any of its various immediate historical predecessors had previously established. That particular unifying movement originated specifically with the Safavid family, hereditary spiritual leaders of an established Sufi religious order based in the northwestern Iranian city of Ardabil, whose considerable spiritual authority gradually acquired an increasingly significant military and political dimension through strategic alliance with various Turkic tribal groups, collectively known to history as the Kizilbash, meaning redheads, in reference to their distinctive red headgear. Under the leadership of the young Safavid leader Ismail I, Safavid military forces achieved remarkably rapid and decisive military success during the final years of the 15th century, and in 1501 CE Ismail successfully captured the city of Tabriz and formally proclaimed himself Shah, thereby establishing the Safavid dynasty as the first ruling power in many centuries to successfully bring the greater part of the broader Iranian plateau under genuinely unified native Iranian rule once again. Ismail's single most historically consequential decision, however, concerned religious rather than purely territorial matters. He formally declared Twelver Shia Islam to be the official state religion of his newly established kingdom, a decisive move that fundamentally and permanently distinguished Iran religiously from the surrounding Sunni-majority Ottoman and Uzbek states that bordered his new realm on multiple sides. Because the general Iranian population at that particular historical moment remained overwhelmingly Sunni in religious orientation, this comprehensive religious conversion was enforced through the application of considerable direct coercion, including the systematic execution or forced exile of established Sunni religious scholars throughout the newly unified kingdom, combined with a deliberate importation of trained Twelver Shia clergy from already established religious centers within the broader Arab world, specifically to help build an entirely new religious institutional structure within Iran itself. This significant and far-reaching religious transformation carried substantial historical consequences that extended considerably far beyond the immediate scope of Safavid-era politics alone. The formal establishment of Twelver Shia Islam as official state religion created a genuinely lasting institutional and broader cultural distinction between Iran and its various Sunni-majority neighboring states, effectively embedding a distinct religious identity that would continue shaping Iranian political culture, foreign relations, and internal social structure for many subsequent centuries, functioning together alongside Persian language and preserved pre-Islamic historical memory as one of the essential core pillars of a distinctly Iranian national and religious identity that would persist through numerous subsequent dynastic changes and political transformations extending all the way into the modern era. Following the collapse of Safavid authority earlier in the 18th century, Iran experienced several decades of political fragmentation and competing regional dynasties, including the brief Afsharid period under Nader Shah and the subsequent Zand dynasty centered in Shiraz before the Qajar family, originally a Turkic tribal group from northern Iran, succeeded in reunifying the country under Agha Muhammad Khan Qajar, who established the Qajar dynasty formally in 1789 after a prolonged and often brutal campaign of consolidation. This new dynasty inherited a country still recovering from decades of internal warfare, and it would face challenges of an entirely different character from anything previous Iranian dynasties had confronted, as expanding European imperial powers began exerting sustained military and diplomatic pressure on Iran's frontiers for the first time in the country's long history. The most immediate and consequential of these pressures came from an expanding Russian Empire pushing steadily southward into the Caucasus region during the early 19th century. The First Russo-Persian War, fought between 1804 and 1813, ended in decisive Russian victory and forced Qajar Iran to accept the humiliating Treaty of Gulistan in 1813, under which Iran formally ceded extensive Caucasian territories including Georgia, Dagestan, and several Khanates in what is now Azerbaijan, while also granting Russia exclusive naval rights on the Caspian Sea. A second Russo-Persian War followed in the 1820s, again ending in Iranian defeat, and the resulting Treaty of Turkmenchay in 1828 compounded these losses further, forcing Iran to cede its remaining Caucasian territories north of the Araz River, including the Nakhchivan and Yerevan Khanates, while also imposing a substantial war indemnity and granting Russian merchants extensive trading privileges within Iranian territory. These treaties permanently redrew Iran's northern border and established a pattern that would define much of the 19th century. European powers dictating terms to a weakened Qajar state largely unable to resist through military means. This period also saw growing British involvement in Iranian affairs, driven primarily by British strategic anxiety over safeguarding the approaches to India, and the resulting competition between Russian and British interests within Iran became known to historians as the Great Game. Both powers extracted economic concessions from successive Qajar Shahs, who frequently granted exclusive rights over railways, telegraph lines, banking, and resource extraction to foreign companies, and interests in exchange for loans and political support. Arrangements that generated significant domestic Iranian resentment, as the practical benefits of these concessions flowed disproportionately toward foreign interests, rather than toward Iranian economic development. Perhaps the most notorious example came in 1872, when Nasir al-Din Shah granted an extraordinarily sweeping concession to a British subject named Baron Julius de Ruyter, covering railways, mining, and various other economic sectors across the entire country. A deal so comprehensive that domestic and Russian pressure eventually forced its cancellation, though smaller but still significant concessions continued throughout the following decades. This accumulating pattern of foreign economic penetration, combined with growing domestic frustration over royal extravagance, ineffective governance, and the absence of any meaningful check on royal authority, eventually crystallized into a genuine indigenous reform movement demanding fundamental change to Iran's political system. The Constitutional Revolution, which unfolded between 1905 and 1911, brought together an unusually broad coalition of merchants, religious clergy, secular intellectuals, and ordinary urban populations in sustained protest against royal absolutism, culminating in Muzaffar al-Din Shah's reluctant agreement in 1906 to establish Iran's first national parliament, known as the Majlis, and to accept a formal constitution limiting royal power. This movement represented a genuinely significant moment in Iranian political history, demonstrating substantial indigenous demand for constitutional government and popular political participation, developed independently of any external imposition. However, the revolution's achievements remained incomplete and precarious. Continued foreign interference, particularly renewed Russian military intervention that helped restore a more assertive monarchy under Muhammad Ali Shah in 1908, along with ongoing internal political divisions between more radical and more conservative constitutionalist factions, prevented the movement from achieving comprehensive or lasting institutional transformation, leaving Iran with a weakened constitutional framework that would persist in uneasy tension with royal authority for decades afterward. Even as this political struggle unfolded, an entirely new factor was reshaping Iran's relationship with foreign powers. The discovery of substantial oil reserves in southwestern Iran in 1908, near Masjid Soliman in the province of Khuzestan. This discovery led directly to the formation of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which secured an extensive and highly favorable concession, granting it exclusive rights to extract and export Iranian oil for decades, terms that provided the Iranian government with only a modest share of the resulting revenue compared to the company's overall profits. Oil quickly became a central axis of foreign involvement in Iranian affairs, particularly for Britain, which came to rely heavily on Iranian oil to fuel its navy and broader imperial infrastructure. And this resource dependency would shape British policy toward Iran for the remainder of the 20th century, creating a persistent structural tension between Iranian aspirations for economic sovereignty and British determination to protect what it regarded as a strategically vital resource. The Qajar dynasty's political authority continued deteriorating through the early 20th century, compounded further by the disruptive impact of the First World War, during which Iran, despite declaring neutrality, became a battleground for competing Ottoman, Russian, and British military operations that devastated significant portions of the country and contributed to severe famine conditions. Amid this ongoing instability, Reza Khan, an ambitious military officer who had risen through the ranks of Iran's Cossack Brigade, orchestrated a military coup in 1921 and subsequently consolidated increasing personal power over the following years, eventually deposing the last Qajar Shah and establishing himself as Reza Shah Pahlavi in 1925, founding what became the Pahlavi dynasty. Reza Shah pursued an ambitious and often forceful program of centralizing reform explicitly modeled in part on Kemal Ataturk's contemporary modernization efforts in neighboring Turkey. He worked to disarm and subordinate Iran's traditionally powerful tribal confederations, significantly expanded the country's road and railway infrastructure, established a modern national army and centralized bureaucracy, and pursued substantial secularizing reforms that reduced the traditional influence of religious clergy over education and the legal system. His government mandated Western-style dress, promoted secular education, and worked to construct a modern national identity, increasingly emphasizing Iran's pre-Islamic historical heritage alongside its Islamic character. A deliberate ideological project that connected directly back to the ancient historical narrative this documentary has traced from the earliest Achaemenid period forward. However, Reza Shah's rule also grew increasingly authoritarian over time, suppressing political dissent and consolidating personal power in ways that limited genuine popular participation, despite the regime's modernizing rhetoric. Reza Shah's reign ended abruptly during the Second World War, when Britain and the Soviet Union, concerned about his government's perceived pro-German sympathies and eager to secure a reliable supply corridor for military aid to the Soviet Union, jointly invaded and occupied Iran in 1941, forcing Reza Shah's abdication in favor of his young son, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, who would rule Iran for the following 37 years until the revolution that ultimately ended his reign. The most consequential and controversial episode of Mohammad Reza Shah's early reign centered on the growing political movement to nationalize Iran's oil industry, a cause championed most prominently by Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, who took office in 1951 with strong parliamentary and popular support. Mossadegh moved decisively to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, as the former Anglo-Persian Oil Company had been renamed, asserting Iranian sovereign control over the country's most valuable natural resource after decades of what many Iranians regarded as deeply inequitable foreign exploitation. This nationalization provoked intense British opposition, and Britain, unable to reverse the policy through direct diplomatic or economic pressure alone, ultimately enlisted American intelligence cooperation to organize a coup against Mossadegh's government. In August 1953, this coup, orchestrated jointly by British intelligence and the American Central Intelligence Agency in an operation historically known as Operation Ajax, successfully removed Mossadegh from power through a combination of political manipulation, propaganda, and organized street unrest, restoring and substantially strengthening Mohammad Reza Shah's personal authority in the process. Documentary evidence and subsequent official acknowledgements from both British and American governments have confirmed the direct intelligence agency roles in this operation. An episode that generated lasting Iranian resentment toward both Western powers, and that many historians identify as a significant contributing factor to the deep anti-Western sentiment that would later fuel the 1979 revolution. Following the coup, Mohammad Reza Shah pursued an ambitious modernization program known as the White Revolution, launched in 1963, which included substantial land reform redistributing agricultural land from large landowners to peasant cultivators, expanded women's suffrage and educational access, and significant industrial development initiatives funded increasingly by growing oil revenues. These reforms produced genuine economic growth and modernization in various sectors, but they also generated substantial social disruption, displacing traditional rural power structures without always providing adequate replacement livelihoods, while economic benefits from oil wealth remained highly unevenly distributed, concentrating disproportionately among urban elites and government-connected interests, while many ordinary Iranians experienced limited improvement in their material circumstances. This uneven modernization proceeded alongside increasingly systematic political repression, enforced substantially through SAVAK, the Shah's secret police organization, which conducted extensive surveillance, arbitrary detention, and documented torture of political dissidents across the political spectrum, from secular leftist and nationalist opposition figures to religious clergy critical of the regime's policies. This combination of uneven economic benefit, cultural disruption from rapid westernization, and systematic political repression gradually alienated broad segments of Iranian society, creating conditions in which secular leftist, nationalist, and religious opposition movements, despite significant ideological differences among themselves, increasingly found common cause in opposing the Shah's rule. This convergence of opposition ultimately culminated in the Iranian Revolution of 1978 and 1979, a genuinely mass popular uprising involving sustained strikes, mass demonstrations, and eventually military defections that overwhelmed the Shah's government despite its extensive security apparatus. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, a senior Shia religious scholar who had spent years in exile due to his outspoken opposition to the Shah's policies, emerged as the movement's most influential and ultimately dominant leader, returning to Iran in February 1979 amid overwhelming popular acclaim, shortly after the Shah's departure into permanent exile. Khomeini and his allies moved swiftly to establish the Islamic Republic of Iran, formally ratified through a national referendum in 1979, creating a distinctive governing structure that combined nominally democratic elected institutions, including a president and parliament, with ultimate authority vested in clerical religious leadership through the position of supreme leader, a novel constitutional arrangement without direct historical precedent that fundamentally reshaped Iran's political system. The consolidation of this new Islamic Republic occurred amid immediate and severe external pressure, as neighboring Iraq under Saddam Hussein launched a full-scale invasion of Iran. In September 1980, exploiting the apparent chaos and military disorganization following the revolution in an attempt to seize territory and weaken the fledgling Iranian government. The resulting Iran-Iraq War continued for 8 devastating years until 1988, producing enormous casualties on both sides through a brutal conflict that included static trench warfare reminiscent of earlier 20th century conflicts, chemical weapons attacks, and extensive damage to civilian infrastructure and oil production facilities. This war became a formative and deeply traumatic national experience for the new Islamic Republic, reinforcing revolutionary solidarity and nationalist sentiment, even as it inflicted enormous human and economic costs that shaped Iranian society and politics for decades afterward. In the decades following this devastating war, Iran's Islamic Republic has navigated a complex and often turbulent path, shaped by internal political factionalism between reformist and conservative political currents, recurring international tension particularly surrounding its nuclear program, and sustained economic sanctions imposed by the United States and other Western powers that have significantly constrained the country's economic development. These ongoing challenges have unfolded against a backdrop of periodic negotiation and confrontation with Western powers over Iran's nuclear activities, alongside Iran's continued regional political and military influence across the broader Middle East. Developments that continue shaping Iran's relationship with the international community into the present day. Viewed across this entire historical arc, from the earliest Median and Persian tribal communities on the Iranian plateau, through Achaemenid imperial grandeur, Parthian resilience, Sasanian centralization, the transformative Arab-Islamic conquest, centuries of Persian cultural revival under Turkic and Mongol political dominance, the decisive Safavid establishment of Shia religious identity, and finally, the turbulent modern transition through Qajar decline, Pahlavi modernization, and Islamic Revolution. Modern Iranian identity emerges as a genuinely layered historical inheritance. It carries within it Achaemenid traditions of statecraft and administrative organization, Zoroastrian ethical and religious concepts that predate Islam by many centuries, Islamic theological and legal frameworks absorbed and adapted over more than a millennium, deep Persian linguistic and literary pride sustained continuously since Ferdowsi's era, and the more recent, still unfolding experience of nationalist assertion and religious revolutionary transformation, all functioning simultaneously within the complex political and cultural reality that constitutes contemporary Iran.